Gentlemen, we're going to talk about cooking a HEMA tournament. What do we mean by this? HEMA tournaments carry all sorts of issues, benefits on an ontological level, on a etymological level, so we have to define our terms. And this makes things difficult, but at the same time enables us to provide some optimization for creating a HEMA tournament and what necessarily should be an ideal HEMA tournament that should endure. So let's begin. Let's define our terms. What is a tournament? A tournament is a place where people under stress and under an assessment of their peers, often with judges and referees, can determine within a specific set of standards and rule sets who is the better performer, better athlete, based on a myriad of different criteria. And by doing that, someone has to win the tournament in order to be a better person. Now, this isn't a bad thing. A lot of people don't like going to competitions for a myriad of different reasons, often psychological. Some people don't like dealing with high stress. Other people think that it's a sham. I find it very ironic that a lot of HEMA people who go to a lot of tournaments say it doesn't mean much, and then they're the type of people who win a lot of tournaments. So if you're going to do a HEMA tournament, I suggest you go to one and you compete, because it's a nice thing to do, and it shows that you should go above and beyond and perform as you would like to, in the best way based on your own expectations. So with that in mind, there are multiple ways to do a HEMA tournament. There are multiple rule sets that exist, and these provide different incentives in order to, if we go purely on a rules-based system, provide different behaviors which become emphasized, which kind of detract from, let's say, a mode of reality. This becomes its own underlining point of reality when the exchange takes place. It has its own confines, rules which are enforceable, and explicitly these rules rather than social norms. So we have a detraction from culture to the game-based system that's being played, and this provides a myriad of issues, namely gamification. Now, gamification is, by the rules and by programming, you're going to use the behavior to optimize to get the best outcome as a result. Now, this isn't something that only applies to humans. There's the paperclip dilemma. So if you get an AI or a robot to make as many paper clips as possible in the most optimum amount of time possible, if the AI is intelligent enough, it may deduce that in order to do so, it has to wipe out humanity and the planet. This is the problem with optimization, and it's the problem seen when we get AIs to play video games and learn them. They often optimize to play the game in a way that's unanticipated. It often means that you have what are called unintended consequences or second and third order effects. Now, these aren't things that are only limited to gaming or any system which requires competition or sports. If you raise or lower interest rates, for example, through unintended consequences, it has an effect on property prices. It's not that it's deliberately done, it's just that what is happening is an inadvertent consequence that no one really anticipated but happens anyway. And the same goes for HEMA tournaments, and the same goes for other systems as well, which is why it's always good to have a diversity of systems and also to be implicated with a certain culture of what's expected and not expected, rather than going solely by the rule set itself. So in order to prove this point, we have to go through the different systems that happen to do with HEMA and the different rule sets, essentially. That's what I meant, rule sets. And show essentially what the mechanics are of these and what the pitfalls that happen as a result of these, why they occur. So the first one we'll go to is right of way. Now, right of way has existed. It's probably the oldest surviving rule set we have for fencing. And it is essentially that the first person to get the score wins. Now, this isn't an issue of itself if there's a whole culture behind it. And if you're living in, 18th century France and it's the first blood, having in a duel, having a right of way is actually quite useful and enables the exchange to be more cleaner. It stops doubling to an extent with the cultural rules, but it's often without it enables a lot more doubling. It often means that things can be arbitrarily more determined, more than if things had been messy, for example. And also for things like the small sword or épée, it's actually quite useful as a system because it's informed by the function of the sword that is currently being undergone in terms of performance on how successful the person is using it. Now, there are pitfalls to these. The first thing is there's a lot of doubles. If you don't have the right cultural context, there are people who are going to be doubling all the time to the extent where you require, specialized tagging and slow motion to see what's going on. We've seen the end result of this in the Olympics where there isn't really much technique. It's about who can land the shot the fastest. Parry and riposting seems really bland and a split second. And also, it has a knock on effect on things like the Olympic saber, the foil, for example, épée, which often become smaller, lighter, and like basically car antennas when they're hitting each other. So, even then, that diminishes the exchange and results in a complete detraction from the original intention of why these systems existed. And this is what I like to call the peacock effect. Now, you've seen a peacock, you've seen what a peacock is and how it operates as an animal. But what's more interesting is peacocks, to attract mates, will have feathers on their tail that will often have a number of colors, and they're used to attract essentially a potential mate. It gets to the point where the peacock feather, because of evolutionary optimization, becomes so large and cumbersome that it loses all original intent and purpose in relation to why that tail exists. Now, it creates a very large tail, but it's often not very realistic. And this becomes problematic. We have issues with humans as well, because humans are animals to an extent, evolved animals. And because of that, this applies to body type. It applies to certain other things, which I'm not going to talk about. But the point is that evolution can be optimized in such a way due to selection where you get things which become more biologically a hindrance, which would have been seen either by preference or choice as something which would have been preferable, but the times have changed. And this is no different to that. And this happens in kendo as well. The emphasis on men, for example, the downwards cut, and the whole life in every breath and landing a killing blow in one go, often means that the mentality often doesn't conform to the original intention, which is, pre-war Kenjutsu and Gekigan, which is sparring with a shinai in place of a katana. So now we go on to other things like, afterblow and weighted afterblow. These are that if you land the blow and somebody lands it, within the same time frame of a different part of the body or the same part, if it's not a double, the person who lands a shot to the head firstly gets 3 points. The person who lands a shot to the body, the opponent in that same time period, afterwards, so it has to be an afterblow, might get 2 points. So the person who landed the head blow gets 1 point basically, because you detract that 2 from the 3. Now, this is a more realistic setting in terms of assessing the criteria on how blows are landed if we're going to talk about accurate sword fighting. Now, there's sword fighting, the sport, and then there's, I guess, live combat with sharps, but nobody does that. Some people have in the past for some reason. But there's a myriad of issues because it is not the real thing, which becomes detracted and gamified as a result. And that can be things like specific target areas become more prioritized, which might be more realistic, the head. But also, because nobody's actually sword fighting, it's really up in the air on how much damage a blow would do. Like if you land a light blow to the head, is that going to be worth the 3 points compared to if you land a cleaving blow? But you don't want to injure your tournament opponent or sparring partner. It also means that it, in a way, incentivizes a lot more reckless behavior as it does with doubles, which is also the issue uh, with right of way. So if you know that you're going to be at a disadvantage and somebody's going to land headshots on you, you're going to aim for their head, or you're going to cancel it out, and you're going to aim from the body. So it enables an element if you're well accustomed enough to be more reckless as a result. And by doing that in the long game via attrition, you can weigh down that person's score, which otherwise would have been cleaner. And that makes for not clean fencing. And if you are recreating the HEMA tournament as a means of recreating an unarmored sword fight, you want to ideally hit and not be hit at the same time. But in the heat of the moment, with every gamified system where people are going to win, this happens in computerized systems as well, you are going to get to an extent where people are going to take advantage of that because there's no real risk. And that's kind of the issue here, is that a lot of this stuff really, apart from assessing how good of a fencer you are, doesn't carry, in the end, any real risk in the same way a live sword fight will. Now, I'm not saying people need to grab the sharps and start, butchering each other on the streets. That's not what I'm saying at all. And I think also, if we're going to get meta about this, is a takeaway from understanding HEMA as being a sport and being separately a lethal martial arts system. All martial arts systems require some sort of cooperative training and tournament to assess who's better without people actually getting hurt. And this is the history of all martial arts training through history, or weapon combat, or armed styles, or unarmed styles that have existed throughout the breadth of history. So it's not really it's not really a appropriate dichotomy in any case. So the third one is continuous sparring. You see this with boxing, because boxing is about bludgeoning the other person, and it's about endurance. But it's essentially where you don't score and you keep consistently having the engagement go on despite people getting hit for like 3-minute rounds, and then there's a break and then you resume. And it just keeps going on basically for a set number of rounds. And the judges will assess based on how aggressive each fighter was, how passive they were, how much they gained control, space, how much they were able to dominate their opponent, how much agility and dexterity they had. All of these factors are going to be brought into consideration compared to, say, who scored the most points, or who got to 10 points first. Now, this one's really interesting because essentially it is assessing a more realistic scenario where the engagement doesn't simply end. There are situations where historical accounts where sword fights can go on for a very long time. There's footage as well about machete fighting where people just go on and on despite the fact they've taken multiple blows. So it's not necessarily not realistic, but again, this dichotomy isn't really relevant as we've established. So we have to then assess, like, what are the pitfalls of continuous sparring? And the answer is gamification again. The pitfall is that with no real risk, people will tend to be more aggressive, wail on each other, and also have more of a disregard for their own well-being. And this happens with other rule sets that we determined as well, which means that we see this with, for example, a screamer, where people will just wail on each other without any regard for their safety and take multiple blows. So you essentially have two people wet noodling each other and fighting each other and bludgeoning each other without any consideration for skill to an extent. Now, again, when it gets to a cultural issue, that might be diminished, but from a pure mechanical rule set, explicit rules, that's going to be the end result because it's about incentives and how people will gamify the system. So these are kind of the main ones. There's other ones like the Festool rules where you can only land a cut to the head, which is quite interesting. But that only favors certain fencing systems like Maya, and also means that you can really only cut because to the head. So you cannot thrust somebody, you cannot grapple them, you cannot hit with the pommel, for example, which in a way provides a large amount of skill because you have to be skilled in providing a very good head blow. But that means that rather than having Maya's system in other systems, people might become more risk averse or more suicidal, or engagements might become more boring as there's too many setups, or things might become more muddled, which is what we've seen with people actually on YouTube doing Festool rules without protection, only eye protection. Um, so there's, when we talk about these things, even stuff like this can have drawbacks based on what the incentives are for the HEMA tournament. So how do we get around this and how do we optimize a good HEMA tournament? Rules by themselves don't mean anything. Laws consisting entirely by themselves are meaningless if there is not the necessary culture to back it up. So English common law, and we saw this with the British Empire, because what the British Empire would do is when they were negotiating getting rid of their colonies in the 50s and 60s, they would leave these British Commonwealth common law systems as a framework for the countries that are now created, basically. Kenya, India, I don't know, Sri Lanka, uh, Egypt might be another one, though that I don't think that necessarily applies. Canada. The issue is with English common law, despite the fact it has global predominance, it really requires the cultural presets behind it that can only really be found on a specific set of people in order for it to function properly. And in places like India, where the culture is not the same, you begin getting modifications to the extent where it's no longer really the same, and the interpretation of it is no longer really the same. And also the culture is not the same because the British people, English people, Scottish, Welsh, who have been together for a long time and are more coherent in that case, or more cohesive, is not going to be the same culture as people in India. And India is a very diverse place, but even then, you're asking to instill a system where that system has not really been apparent. And the good example of this is the war in Afghanistan. America thought that it could put a Western democracy in Afghanistan, even after they'd taken out bin Laden and had tried to destroy the Taliban. Another good example is Iraq. There was this expectation that Iraq would become a Western power if only we replaced the Saddam regime with a secular democracy. And the answer is no, that didn't happen. All that happened is you got sectarian violence, violence between Sunnis and Shias, and essentially the people of Iraq aren't Americans. They don't abide by the same cultural precepts. So the understanding that the idea that they somehow would start waving American flags and abiding by American style democracy and law really doesn't add up. And you see this in South America as well, because these places have somewhat westernized systems, but the consequences and culture are different, that it doesn't really work in the same way. And in some cases might actually be a detriment. Where am I going with this? Well, the whole point of a rule system is there has to be some sort of culture, so a set of values that are taken for granted implicitly to inform the laws or rules which are putting down explicitly. laws and rules are really a reflection of cultural standards implicitly that are taken for granted. Laws that we have now, which may not seem relevant, 100 to 200 years ago, seemed very relevant because the standards and times were very different. And the cultural precepts were very different. People were a lot more religious back then, a lot less children being born out of wedlock, a lot less divorces, people went to church more. All of these things were far more common wherever you went in the world. That was Christian, for example, in the West. So these really inform how people behave. And if you take the culture out of the rule set, what you begin getting is these unintended consequences. So in a way, it's actually more of an organic solution. So, right, we need to have cultural values that inform the tournament rule set and what we're doing. What is that? Sword fighting. We need to have some sort of assessment on what is acceptable norms and standards to do with sword fighting when it comes to a blow, whether it comes to conduct. What are the values that we're setting that offset the incentives and make it apparent that the sword fighting needs to be respected within its necessary conduct. And when you have that focus point, what you tend to find is that the rules really come into their own in that sense. And people behave ideally like the community would like them to behave. And there are implicit social norm consequences if they don't. And one of those will be that simply you don't even need to ban these people. They're just not going to come back because the majority of people don't want them back. So you have a community effect now that will reverberate throughout the entire thing. So we've gotten that out of the way. How do we take care of the gamification element really at its core? Gamification begins to become apparent when it is predictable what the system will be. Now, I'm not saying we randomize things completely, but what we do is we need to create a number of variables that keep people on their feet and keep them wondering how things are going to go. Because if everybody knows that right of way is the main rule, they're going to gamify that whether or not it is conscious or not. Because humans gamify things all the time subconsciously without realizing it. So we need to assess the next step now. And the answer to this is, and there are issues with this which I'm going to go into, is you need to create a higher plane of multivariance to circumvent this incentive system. And that is by creating multiple systems within the same tournament. What do I mean by this? So there are four rule sets in different stages that the person has to abide by. So you have 4 stages. The first one is right of way. The second one is afterblow. The third one is special rules. And the fourth one is continuous sparring. Those are the 4 rules that we have that have to be done in stages. So first stage is this one, elimination. Second stage is this one, elimination. Third stage, this one, elimination. Fourth stage, we have the different rules set. And what you do is you make that ambiguous and you draw it by random lot. So you don't tell people, not only do you not tell the people what the stages of the rule set are going to be until they come at the last second at the tournament, because you want them to keep them on their feet so they can't gamify things in advance or have the mentality to gamify things in advance. So 10 seconds before the event, you tell people that first round is continuous sparring, and now they know the game. So not only does that happen, not only is it drawn randomly by lots until the last second, but you keep it ambiguous until then. You make it so that even the judges who are preparing for these and have been used to these rule sets don't understand what's going on until, sooner to the time where things are taking place. So they know there's these 4 systems. That will keep them prepared enough to do it. They don't know the order in which they're going to take place. So everybody is kind of in the ambiguous fog of what they think is going to happen. Now, there's a number of issues with this when we talk about HEMA tournaments. It is more cost intensive. It requires more preparation. It requires an element of logistics, which all the judges have to be trained on, and it requires simply more time intensive things happening. Ideally, I would say the tournament is for different weapon sets. You're not looking at a 2 day period, you're probably looking at a 4 day period, which, if people are willing to do and put the money in, that is going to make things a lot more convenient. But if not, then we have a logistical issue, because all of this is based on ultimately what the community itself, right? So if we were really to cook a good HEMA tournament, and I'm speaking about really good ingredients here, we would have a tournament where we have a good implicit morality does play a part in cultural code on what's acceptable and not acceptable behavior that hasn't become institutionalized. I mean, you can have cultural institutions, but it has to be from the ground up. It has to be organic. And people who understand the historical context behind those cultural values. But also, to prevent gamification, you have to randomize the precepts for each stage. Now, it's difficult, but I believe it can be done. And you essentially have to mitigate circumstances to make it more possible. So there has to be more people at the HEMA tournament. Or actually, to make it easier, there has to be less people at the HEMA tournament. So, I don't know, an average HEMA tournament might have, I don't know, let's say 50 people. 50 participants for 4 weapon sets. And some weapon set. Let's use longsword for these 4 stages because it's going to be far simpler. The Festool rules really aren't going to work for rapier, for example. So you have to randomize systems that are appropriate to rapier and dagger and small sword and saber, etc. Though saber probably can work with longsword a lot better, or stick fighting or something. You have 50 people. You might want to reduce that to 25 people. And then do the eliminations via the stage, the different stages of different assessments. By doing this, I think a good balance can be struck between making things, keeping people on their feet long enough to have these multiple variables, while at the same time keeping a lack of predictability where people cannot necessarily gamify these. Because if you don't know what you're going to experience until the last 10 seconds or last 5 minutes of the tournament where things are being announced, then you can't really practice in advance for them, because you've also adequately enough, because you've also got to practice on these other systems as well, which makes things a lot more beneficial and means that things don't stagnate, they're not etched in stone. They don't provide a context where people are essentially providing the the underlining conditions to gamify a system. I think this is something that should be experimented on and tried. I think it's something that people should take into consideration, and it might be worth having this to see how behaviors can be assessed and how they can change. Now, there's kind of shortfalls to this as well. I think you have to consistently randomize. If you keep the stages the same, so the first stage is always going to be right away, people can gear up for that. But even then, people to an extent will be able to gear up for the other ones as well. So what might actually help is have an interval midway during the round where people have to do something that is on the spur of the moment. So maybe there's an objective-based system that has people on their feet more, that randomizes things further, because with randomized variables, you're more willing to not have the situation where you gamify the system. And it also provides an opportunity for people to see how they improvise in such situations. And improvisation is the key to sparring, as it is the key to most things. But anyway, this is kind of a thought experiment, and I think with this you could cook a more optimized HEMA tournament as a result. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you.